Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Lowne Aerospace 2, a series in which I unlock the entire tech tree in science mode in KSP and hopefully provide some useful tips, tricks and tutorials and insight along the way. Now last week I posed the question of where would you guys like me to go, and the most popular requested destination was Eve. So this week we'll be heading to and returning from Kerbal Space Program's proverbial final boss, and I'll try to do my best to explain everything as we go. So you can see I've already made a start on the Eve lander itself. Building an Eve lander requires consideration of two things. Firstly, the massive amount of delta V required to get back into Eve orbit, and secondly, a design that will be able to safely descend through the extremely hostile atmosphere of the planet when it comes to your initial landing. We're firstly focusing on the Ascent module. The upper stage consists of a Terrier and an FLT-400 tank, topped off with the Mark 1 command pod with all its monopropellant drained and, topped with the small nose cone. And the lower stage will consist of a central core of one FLT-800 tank and one FLT-200 tank, powered by a Vector engine. Vectors are great for Eve ascent stages as they're very powerful, they have a small footprint to reduce drag, and have a huge gimbal range to keep you on course during flight. The stage will be surrounded by three pairs of FLT-400 and another set of FLT-200 tanks in like a stack with nose cones top and bottom to reduce drag. I've also added landing legs and lights to each fuel tank via a small decoupler so that they can be dropped off upon takeoff to increase our thrust to mass ratio, when we're ascending from Eve. In fact, all unnecessary pieces will be jettisoned from our Eve lander upon launch, which we'll get to as we get to them really. I'm going to secure them to the body of the rocket and then duplicate what we just built around so we have a symmetry of 6. I used the symmetry of those 6 ones above just to kind of make sure I was placing them in the right positions. And then we have our basic fuel tank layout there. As you can see, I also added a cheeky couple of RTGs to a couple of those decouplers just to make sure that we could remain fully charged with power during our surface antics. I also want to make sure that this thing stays in one piece upon touchdown, so I'm running some struts in between those decouplers to make sure this thing doesn't fall apart when it hits the ground. Make sure that they're actually attached to the decouplers, not the rocket itself, because struts create a lot of drag, so we don't want them attached to the rocket when we're actually in flight. At least not these ones. We still have some inner struts to connect the fuel tanks to the rocket itself. Now, the way we're going to stage these tanks is with an asparagus configuration. By this I mean each pair of tanks will feed into the next pair sequentially, so that when the outermost tanks are empty, they'll be decoupled, and the next fuel tank pair will take over, still completely full. The easiest way to make an asparagus setup is to use the yellow fuel lines and connect the stages in the order that they'll be dropped, and the engines will always take fuel from the most distant fuel tank with a setup like this. So for the first tanks that get jettisoned, run a fuel line from those to the next pair, and then to the next pair, and then to the central core, and make sure they stage in that order, and you're good. Now for Eve landers, I typically like to add these sort of 4 island units towards the top of the stack. These will contain all the parachute modules we need to land unpowered. So in this case, I'm forming these islands out of 4 Science Junior units placed symmetrically around the body of the rocket, and then with parachutes on the top and bottom of them. Before I place those, though, I'm also going to put these 2 side-mounted tanks on the edges as well. Ignore the fuel lines, I'll get rid of those. These are going to have the drogue chute components on them, so we're going to have the orange drogue chutes on the top and bottom of those orange tanks. I'm also going to stick some very small side-mounted rocket engines to them, just to serve as the deorbit stage of the rocket, so that we don't have to use any of our main rocket's fuel to perform the deorbital maneuver. Another thing we need to do is make sure that we have a ladder that can get us from the cockpit all the way down to the surface, because EVA packs will not work at all on the surface of Eve. Also, I'm attaching these to decouplers so that they can be ditched when we launch, again to conserve weight and, reduce drag as much as possible. At this point, you can see me just making sure all the asparagus staging is correctly staged in the order that we discussed earlier, and then we can add all the parachutes like we discussed. You can see here I'm adding struts between the parachute modules and the rest of the rocket, again, to help with our structural integrity for our Eve landing. I'm also adding a couple of air brakes to the sides of those orange tanks. They're not really necessary, but they will provide a little bit of extra drag upon slowdown, so, may as well use them if we can. You may have also noticed I've added those deorbital engines to those orange tanks as well. But with that, we now have a complete Eve Ascent module. One additional change I just need to note is that I took off the nose cone from the command module and instead attached it via a junior docking port. That way we can still have a docking port on this ship so that it can dock with the mothership, but it also means that we still have a maximal aerodynamics upon our Eve ascent. So whilst having a good ascent stage is all well and good, The ascent is only half the battle with Eve. We also need to ensure it can land as well. Now, the parachutes and obviously landing gear will provide the necessary deceleration for the lower atmosphere, but we still need to protect our ship from the deadly atmospheric heating that Eve landings always encounter in the upper atmosphere. For this, I'm using a structural core attached below the vector engine with a decoupler, and we're going to surround it with 4 structural arms that have an inflatable heat shield below them. However, a design like this will naturally want to flip out of control during descent, so I'm building up this sort of scaffold with the girder pieces here so that we can add 4 heat shields on the top of the rocket as well to provide maximum aerodynamic stability and create more drag with which we can slow down to parachutable speeds. It is important though that with those top heat shields, you have them to jettison all at once with a single action group, just so that you don't cause any crack and glitches. They do all need to detach at the same time. Not so bad for the bottom ones because we can remove those via the decoupler below the vector engine. And then we're going to strut the scaffold to the rocket, making sure the struts run from the scaffold to the rocket, not the other way around, so they don't leave any draggy components stuck to the rocket once they're gone. But there we are. That was the toughest part of the build out of the way. Well, I guess I'm still adding lots and lots of struts. You can never really have too many struts on your descent stage. Like I said, struts create a lot of drag, and drag is what we really want lots of during our Eve descent. So strut away. Just make sure it's all attached to the bits that are going to fall off, rather than, the main rocket, because again, we want to conserve. We want to reduce the amount of drag wherever possible. Now it's time for the actual transfer stage itself. So I'm going to add a the lander can unit here. That's going to be the main command module for the ship. Heat shield, decoupler, and a structural adapter underneath. I'm going to attach 4 of those liquid fuel tanks, so liquid fuel only, not liquid fuel plus oxidizer tanks, underneath, as well as a SAS wheel and a battery and a nuclear engine. Not got all that much delta V, and one nuclear engine will be very weedy when it comes to moving this thing around, so I'm going to attach 8 decouplers around this core and then build out those fuel tanks again, do another stack of 4, as well as more SAS wheels, more batteries to make sure this thing remains powered and is still controllable, and we can round off those peripheral tanks with more nuclear engines, so our thrust weight ratio should be a lot more tolerable now. You may have also noticed I put a small relay dish on the central core of that stage, just so that we can maintain a connection to Kerbin, and crucially that the lander itself can connect to Kerbin via a relay hop with the command unit left in orbit. Although our lander will be flown by Jebediah Kerman, he wanted to have a going somewhere, so it's not really that important. It's just kind of there because we can, and it makes life a little bit easier in the event that we might need it. And again, just make sure that lower stage is all strutted together with the rest of the ship. Now, we've only got 4 Science Junior units so far, which we could do better than that. So I'm going to add 4 mystery goo units, all 4 of them on those 2 Science Junior units that are near the command pod door. That means that all a Kerbal has to do is go on EVA, and they can immediately access and take the data from all of the science units without having to do any kind of EVA jumping or EVA pack use. They can all just be done from the ladder outside the command pod. And I've also bound all the science experiments to action groups as well, so we can run them as fast as possible, which will be very, very important when doing science in Eve's upper atmosphere, where we'll have literally like 10 seconds to do all the experiments before the Kerbal will succumb to the atmospheric heating. So got to make sure they're very accessible. The other Science Junior units are fine at the back because they can just be accessed once they're on the surface of Eve. I've brought 4 Science Junior units because Jebediah will be flying the lander, and he can't reset the Science Junior units like Bob can, so may as well just bring 4 of them. We only need 3, but 4 makes a nice symmetry. And I don't know, in case you mess up, you accidentally run one and then you can't reset it, you got a spare. In fact, a spare will come in useful for reasons that will become evident once the mission is underway. Finally, I sorted out all the action groups that I already mentioned earlier, but yep, I've got all the heat shields to inflate together with an action group, which isn't that necessary. The important one is making sure all of the top heat shields are jettisoned as one via an action group, and just a few things like having the ladder on the ship deployed through an action group is kind of cool. And I'm trying to think what else I bound to an action group. I think the cargo bay doors on the lander can that will get us back to Kerbin are also toggled with an action group, because that's where all the parachutes are for the actual Kerbin descent stage. But here you can see we're building just a really big lifter. There's not much to really talk about. I'm using the biggest parts we have available to us. Technically, there are the Saturn V parts that came with the Making History DLC, but as I've said time and time before in this series, We're not going to be using any DLC pieces, so we are left with just these ones to form the Ascend stage. And, you know, not much to it really, just a kind of Falcon Heavy-esque looking setup, although these boosters will not be recoverable. And I guess we could probably get ready to launch. Oh, I'm doing a kind of asparagus setup with the actual big lifter. We're using fuel lines to have the side boosters feed into the main tank, and then once they detach, we'll leave the main tank fully filled with fuel still. But that's all there is to talk about really with the actual construction of this lander. I don't think there's much more to talk about that I haven't already addressed. Just go back here, I guess. I guess I wasn't quite satisfied with the amount of struts we had. We had to make extra double sure that we had enough struts. Now, I was going to bring Jebediah and Valentina. Valentina would stay on the command pod, the command ship, I should say, and Jebediah would fly the lander, or the other way around. The crucial thing is that they're both pilots. But in my habits of always bringing Bob, I just packed Bob to pilot the command unit, which means he can't create maneuver nodes if there's no direct connection to the Kerbal Space Center, which is why I wanted a pilot on it. But it's not a big issue. To be quite honest, we can do a lot of the docking using the Ascent stage anyway. One final thing to note with those big side boosters there, they're very, very big. Might be safe to add some Separatrons just to ensure they can definitely clear themselves off the main body of the rocket. But they're not essential. This thing does work without them. Now we just have to wait for an Eve transfer window, which if you remember from the Gilly episode is about 54 degrees behind Kerbin. So if you were to draw a line from Kerbin to the Sun to Eve, it would be about 5:15. You know, the angle it forms at the Sun would be 54 degrees. But it's not important to get it that dead on. I just tend to eyeball it like you can see me doing here. If you want to get it perfect, you can use Transfer Window Planner or Kerbal Alarm Clock or something. But I find it easier just to do it this way, to be quite honest with you. And then I guess we can go to the launch pad and get ready to launch. So here we are, well underway. And like I've said in the previous 2 episodes, I'm not going to discuss simple things like launching, creating maneuver nodes, that sort of thing, because, well, Eve is a very difficult place to go to. Going to Eve is tough. Even experienced players will find it very challenging. So I would urge that a mission to and from its surface should only be attempted if you are capable of performing interplanetary missions without the need for a guide and can confidently perform orbital rendezvous between a command ship and an ascent module. So if you can basically do something like Juno and back with ease, like you don't need any help whatsoever, and can do the docking around Juno, then you're probably going to be alright. It is still much harder to do Eve, but you're on the right track, and the only way you're going to learn is by pushing yourself, is what I always said. These are all concepts, you know, the basics of ascending, docking, that sort of thing. These are all concepts I've covered in earlier episodes in this series, so I'm not going to discuss them too much, especially when it comes to planning interplanetary maneuver nodes. Eve's pretty easy because it's got such a big gravity well. That being said, if you are like very new to the concept of doing interplanetary missions, one of the missions I always recommend is some sort of one-way Eve mission. Hopefully not with a Kerbal. The best way is to send a rover. Land your rover somewhere near Eve's coast, because then you can get 3 biomes very easily. You can run all your rover's experiments on the land that you landed next to, go down close to the body of the water and you'll get the shores biome, and then you'll have the biome that is the actual water itself if you just drive your rover into the sea and float out, or just, you know, stay along the seabed if you make a rover that's heavy enough. I've done this mission in the last series of Lowne Aerospace I did, so just have a look at that. Just type in, I don't know, Matt Lowne Eve rover and you'll get to the result. That's a pretty good first interplanetary mission suggestion, but that's not what we're doing here. There aren't many Eve tutorials on YouTube, I don't think. I know I've never done one, at least not a dedicated tutorial, so I think this fills a nice niche. But like I said, tutorials and Eve aren't really things that go together, because Eve is only something that should be attempted once you're very confident with Kerbal Space Program. I've said time and time before that Eve is effectively the final boss of Kerbal Space Program. It is easily, without doubt, the hardest non-arbitrary challenge in the game. By arbitrary challenge, I mean something like, I don't know, Joule 5. Joule 5 is harder than Eve. It's basically the mission that you do. You go to Joule, land on every single planet, land on every single moon of Joule in one launch, usually without refueling, and then return again. That's obviously very hard, but it's kind of an arbitrary challenge because it has like a set of rules that you have to come up with. Eve is just there and back. There's no rules. You can do whatever you want. that's what I consider a non-arbitrary challenge. A close second to Eve would be Tylo, but we ain't doing that today. We're doing Eve. But that being said, this is not going to be the final episode, because I did say that we could do a grand finale to Eve's surface, and this was very nearly produced enough science. One thing that I forgot is that we've already got science from space high above Eve and space near to Eve, which are both kind of high-yielding scenarios, and they were like factoring into my anticipation of this being the final mission. But because we've already been to Gilly, I've already visited space high above and near to Eve, so we've already got quite a lot of the science. We're only going to be able to get science from Eve's atmosphere, upper and lower, and the one biome that we land in. So unfortunately, we do fall a little bit short of the science in this mission. So, leave any suggestions you have down below of where you think the actual finale for this series will be. I mean, we're literally only like 400 points short after this mission, so we can go literally anywhere and it'll be fine. So as I mentioned, there's our initial Eve encounter. Like I said, I didn't want to talk too much about the interplanetary burn itself, because you should hopefully be able to do that easily if you're going to be attempting Eve. But if you would still like some pointers for transfer windows to Eve and making maneuver nodes, earlier in this series, as I literally just mentioned, we did go to Gilly, and I would have talked about making the maneuver node, getting the encounter and all of that in that episode. So one thing we're going to do here, we're just going to do a quick plane change using normal and anti-normal to make sure that our orbital line passes close to Eve's equator, making sure, of course, that your actual path along Eve is the same direction as its rotation. You're going against Eve's rotation, just because that will really save fuel when it comes to performing our ascent, because we won't have to be launching against the planet's rotation. We can launch with it, thereby gaining a good sort of 200-ish meters per second of free delta V effectively. I'm not gonna we're not gonna do a aero capture at Eve, because its atmosphere is very, very deadly. It ain't no Juno, it ain't no Lathe, it ain't even a Kerbin. It is a whole new beast altogether. So you really can't rely on air braking at Eve whatsoever, unless you bring loads and loads of heat shields. But then the amount of fuel you're probably wasting having to lift that additional dry mass, probably easier just to put a bit more fuel in so that you can do an engine burn to circularize at Eve, because it's not that far away from Kerbin, so you hopefully won't be coming in at a very, very high speed, so it shouldn't cost too much to capture, which it didn't for me in this case, so we can easily perform a circularization burn without needing to rely on aero capturing to save some fuel. I'm not going to be going for a low Eve orbit straight off the bat. In fact, I'm only going to be just about capturing, and that's because I want to perform an inclination change. And inclination changes are much cheaper the higher your height, like the closer you are to apoapsis. So by keeping our apoapsis nice and high, we can perform a normal burn for a relatively low amount of fuel. And this is because the reason I want to perform an inclination change is because I want our orbits to be as close to equatorial as possible, just that our ascent stage can, doesn't have to do much inclination adjustment once it comes to redocking. So we're not going to get a perfect equatorial orbit, but we can get closer than what we are now, which is good enough, quite frankly. The actual nuclear engine cluster we have at the moment is only intended to get us to Eve. It doesn't have enough fuel to get us back to Eve, but the kind of second stage, so once we deploy the peripheral nuclear engines and are just left with the single one, that has like 5,000 meters per second of delta V, so more than enough to perform any kind of Eve orbit rendezvous and get back to Kerbin without any issue. So, I'm not worried about being too precise with our equatorial orbit. And once we've kind of adjusted to a desirable inclination, we can perform the rest of our retrograde burns at periapsis to get ourselves into a roughly circular orbit. I'm aiming for about between 100 and 110 kilometers above the surface, just so that we're nice and clear of the atmospheric line, which in the case of Eve is 90 kilometers, just in case our ascent module ends up behind the commander module once it re-enters Eve orbit. We want to give it some room to have a lower orbit than the commander module so that it can catch up, basically. The lower your orbit, the faster you go. So if you're behind a target, you need to be in a lower orbit. So by having an orbit slightly higher than it needs to be, we have that extra room so that our ascent module can catch up if we need it to. Which actually, in this case, I did need to do that a little bit. So it wasn't actually just there as a failsafe. It ended up actually being useful. So hopefully at this point you've already done your science experiments from space high above Eve, and have now done them from space close to Eve as well, because we're not going to be taking the science experiments back to Kerbin with us. They're going to be left on the surface of Eves. We can't run them again now. So hopefully you did a quick save and can now reload it if you'd forgotten to do that. Not that you should be watching this video for the first time whilst you do your Eve mission as well. You should hopefully have watched this at least once. You already know about this. But if you haven't, there you go. I didn't run them myself because, like I said, I've already got the science before, and I'm trying not to do repeat experiments in this series, so I didn't need to worry about doing that. We're actually going to deorbit the transfer stage here just so that we can ditch the peripheral nuclear engines on a suborbital trajectory. We can quickly put ourselves back into a stable orbit, but it means the nuclear engines aren't going to be left stuck in Eve orbit forever. They'll eventually have their orbit decay by grazing against the top of the atmospheric line and not be left in space forever. But now it's time for the main event, and that is our Eve descent. So I've switched to the lander, and Jebediah is sitting there all excited and ready to go. What I would recommend is just make a quick save before you do anything. Deorbit yourself and see what biome you end up in. This thing cannot land in the sea, nor do you really want to end up in the sea, because you want to be able to plan a flag, because that's the only reason you want to do a surface expeditions, really. But it also makes it easier to access other biomes by running around if you want to get a bit more science. But the main thing, like I said, is that this thing is not really designed to be a sea level Eve lander. I guess I probably should have tested this at a few different heights above sea level so I knew what the cutoff was, but you know, like I said, you should do a quick save before you do your Eve descent. So if you find you're in a position where you can't get back into orbit, you can just reload and go try and aim for a different biome. I just detached that lower fuel tank there. That was there just to feed some liquid fuel into the transfer stage in case we needed it a bit more. We didn't, so I didn't bother using it. We just detached it fully filled with fuel. Seems like a bit of a waste, but there you go. Now, we've entered the atmosphere, so we're going to immediately run all the experiments and then get Jebediah on an EVA so you can do an EVA report, as well as take the crew report from the command pod and take the data from the reusable experiments, which in this case is the thermometer, barometer, and that's it actually, just so we can run those experiments again whilst flying in Eve's lower atmosphere. Plus obviously we need to have an EVA report from the upper atmosphere. Now you might have seen the temperature gauges immediately start popping up very, very quickly on Jebediah's spacesuit, and that's from the very edge of Eve's atmosphere, hence the need for not only speed, it kind of serves as some foreshadowing in terms of how difficult it is to survive entry at Eve, although luckily we've got this nice symmetrical dumbbell layout with those heat shields on the top and bottom, so we should stay nice and stable for the majority, well, for all of our descent, hopefully. Now, Eve's atmosphere gets very thick very quickly around the 60 to 40 kilometer mark, but as you can see, we've managed to survive very, very easily, and we can deploy the parachutes, making sure, of course, they're set to deploy only when safe, which is what they're set as by default anyway, so hopefully you don't need to worry about that. Now, although we're kind of past the danger zone, we are still going to leave the big heat shields attached, and that is because if we were to detach them, we would probably start building up speed again because our main parachutes haven't fully deployed, and like I said, Eve's atmosphere is deadly. It doesn't take much to shred those parachutes. So by having the heat shields remain attached, it means that our drag is kept very, very high and our descent speed is kept controlled. I'm keeping both the bottom and the top attached because if we were to just remove the top heat shields, the thing would start to rock back and forth quite uncontrollably during the descent, which would be a rather nauseating experience for poor Jebediah there. But if we were to attach just the bottom ones, there's a risk that they would kind of explode and hit the bottom of our lander and destroy things. We want to be able to detach the bottom ones all together as their own stage. You can see I've just deployed those top shields, now we're getting nice and low and the parachutes are all opening, but you can see they did kind of all glitch together and explode when we detached them. Not so much of a problem for the top because it's very clear of the rest of the ship. Bit more of an issue if that would happen to the bottom. So we're actually going to deploy them as a stage rather than jettison the heat shields individually. And as you can see, they pull the scaffolding and themselves away without any kind of spazzy glitching out and exploding, which is what would happen if we were to just jettison the heat shields. It's because they're clipped together, that's what causes the problem. And now we're going slow enough Jebediah can perform some science from Eve's lower atmosphere, so crew report, EVA report, and of course all of the reusable experiments, although we don't need to worry about taking the data at this point because it'll be easier and safer to do that once we're on the surface, and we don't have to do any more experiments now until we're on the surface, and we can just redo the experiments once we've taken the data. In addition to this, you should now have used 2 of your Science Junior units and 2 of your Mystery Goo units, leaving you 2 of each remaining. We can't reuse these experiments because we've only got Jebediah, not Bob. Oh, and actually here we are touching down. So yeah, 4.2 meters per second wasn't quite slow enough to save all of our landing gear, but I was expecting at least one landing leg to explode from the forces, because we're not landing on an even surface, so one of them is going to take a bit more brunt than the others. It's quite normal for one to take a little bit more of a beating and explode. As long as we've got the others, it's fine. Now I'm actually running one of the Science Juniors here and then detaching it and letting it fall to the floor. If it survives, that's great. We can just run along the surface and take the science data really, really easily. If it explodes and destroys the Science Junior, run the fourth experiment we've still got there, but I wouldn't risk detaching that one at this stage. I would just get Jebediah. He can actually jump from like those kind of basins left by where the parachutes were. He can actually jump between the side-mounted bits and get to the Science Junior to take the data from the top, but it's a little bit tricky. It takes a bit of hardcore parkour. If you can get away with just detaching it and collecting the data from the surface of Eve, it's a little bit easier. But yeah, we can take the data from the rest of the experiments, making sure once again to do a crew report from the surface, and then exiting the command. You may need to exit the command pod to take the crew report you got from the lower atmosphere first, and then we can climb down the ladder to not only plant our flag, which is obviously the most important part of this mission, but also to collect a surface sample as well. And like I mentioned, we can get the data from the Science Junior unit that we ditched from the top. But there we go, there is our surface sample from Eve's Midlands. The surface appears to have a very strong purple tint to it, or is it grey and it just looks purple because everything else on Eve is? You start to wonder if you're not taking on a purple tint yourself. Very interesting. 240 units of science for the successful recovery of that, which does seem a little bit low, considering places like Moho are far easier than Eve and they yield more surface sample science. But I guess, I don't know, returning from Eve is all about the prestige from being able to do the mission rather than actually the science swag itself. If it were about that, we could have finished the game at this point, but oh well. Oh, look at that lovely view, by the way. We can really sink in that view whilst we're here. Jebediah can make sure he takes lots of snaps for his Instagram. And yes, actually, we haven't planted our flag. That was another thing we needed to do. I usually say at this point, just plant your flag and then name it after the biome you're in, so you can avoid that biome on subsequent missions, so you can really maximize the amount of science. But honestly, if you're doing an Eve mission, you've probably got most of the tech tree unlocked so that science points aren't really an issue. So although I've named it after the Midlands biome we're in, it's not too much of a problem with Eve because, we'll get enough science. You'll probably have a full tech tree by this point, or at least close enough that you won't need to come back to Eve in order to finish unlocking everything. Or maybe you will. Maybe you'll just hardcore like that. I don't know. Thought this was kind of a cool site to visit, by the way. Some of our scaffold survived impact, so thought I'd just come and have a quick inspection there, see what kind of effect Eve impact had on the metals. Get some science, I guess, just for the purely story-driven aspect of this point, the hypothetical science you might get from something like that. And then Jebediah can stand and admire our lander, standing proud of the surface. He's so awestruck by it that it was a whole 12 hours before we decided to move again and get back on board. I just wanted to see what it looked like at night. I mean, I brought those lights for the side. It would be a shame to not at least see what this thing looks like in the dark. So there we are. Now we can make use of that big ladder we built because, again, like I said, Kerbals can't jump very high for one thing on Eve because the surface gravity is very high, and they certainly can't use their jetpacks, so we definitely need to make sure that ladder definitely extends all the way to the surface, which in this case it does. And then we can start planning our ascent itself. Do make doubly sure that you've taken all of the science from all of your science experiments because we're about to ditch them to prepare for our ascent, so we want to make sure we've got all the science. We aren't going to leave anything on the surface, and then we can open up the map screen and time warp to a point where our lander is somewhere directly underneath the orbit line of the mothership. So here was kind of the first place I encountered, but then I thought, probably for the sake of a YouTube video, it might be better if we launch on the light side so that you can actually see what's going on. So I time warped around. Thought this place looked good enough, we're close enough to the orbit line of the mothership that we can get a pretty good encounter, and then we can get ready to launch. So we can pan the camera around, make sure, I'm just double checking here, like I said, making sure we've definitely taken all of the science from those experiments, and going from there, I'm just reviewing my data here. Now, first thing we're going to do is detach all the unnecessary things aside from the landing leg, so that's the ladder, those deorbit fuel tanks and engines, and the science experiments, and then we can throttle up, immediately hitting space to ditch the landing legs, and then we're off. I'm going to go straight up at first, and we're going to open up all the peripheral fuel tanks because that's the only way we're going to see when they're empty. So we're going to wait for that first stage to empty, aiming pretty much straight up, slightly be toward the 90-degree vector to make sure the prograde marker on the nav board is in the right direction. And then we're going to just gradually tip over, very, very gradually. We're also going to keep a close watch on our speed. If our speed is too high, we will explode by the forces of Eve's atmosphere. So I'm going to keep my thrust actually really, really low, certainly below 400 meters per second, below the first cloud layer, which is also kind of the first notch on that atmospheric gauge under our altitude readout. And as you can see, once we ditch those peripheral tanks and we just have a really smooth rocket, our speed increases very, very rapidly. So I'm actually throttling down to barely a quarter, less than a quarter on the actual throttle gauge, and just pointing ourselves about 45 degrees for the rest of the ascent, making sure our speed is very low. Keeping it below 1,000 meters per second at this point. In a second, you'll probably see some temperature gauges appear, and they will very, 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 very quickly rise to high temperatures. So we want to make sure we're kind of avoiding that. There you go, you can see that there. So just before that lower stage burnt out, I throttled up just to kind of give us an extra kick before the Terrier starts up, and we can just carry on with our ascent. Full throttle now because the Terrier is much, much weaker. As you can see, as we're clearing the upper parts of Eve's atmosphere and aerodynamic force are becoming less of an issue, I'm burning closer and closer to kind of the flat trajectory, following prograde marker pretty much. We can also deploy the nose cone because we no longer need it, and we want to make sure we deploy it before we enter a stable orbit so that no debris is left in space. And then we can create a maneuver node at apoapsis to try and get a nice close encounter. Although we don't have very much time before we reach that maneuver node, so we've got to try and make things... We're not going to aim for too much accuracy, just kind of close enough that we can do some fine-tuning once we've entered orbit. As you may recall from when we did the initial Eve circularization, I said that we might want to enter a lower orbit to catch up to the target, which has actually happened. We are behind our target, so we're going to be entering an orbit that's lower than the target. Again, not worried about being too accurate. Just make sure your periapsis is above the atmospheric line. So above 90 kilometers is fine. So I went with 95 to make sure we're definitely clear, and we are definitely still lower than our target. And those indicators there, they aren't that far apart. So in fact, we can make a maneuver node and just use the skip orbit button and just wait for a close encounter that way. I'm not in any rush whatsoever. So yeah, we're going to set the lander as our target, and as you can see, we can just use that skip orbit button, and those little indicators swing around. We can get a really, really close encounter. So just going to pick it when they were at their closest and use retrograde, prograde, normal, anti-normal, radial, and radial out, being very careful that our hypothetical periapsis and apoapsis remain above the atmospheric line. And we can see we can get pretty close indeed. We are actually using the transfer stage here, not the lander stage, because we haven't got much delta V left in the lander. I think we do have enough to perform this maneuver, but may as well use the stage where we have absolutely no question of having enough fuel. And there we go, 0.1 kilometers separation. Can't really ask for much closer than that, so I'm happy with that. We can time warp around to that closest encounter node. So yeah, it takes a few orbits to get there, but it's only the equivalent of 1 kerbin day, just under 4 hours, so in reality, it's not too bad considering Jebediah just spent a whole amount of time on the surface of Eve. He's probably grateful just to be having a nice, tranquil, relaxing orbit around the purple monster he's just returned from. There we are, nearly at our maneuver node. As you can see, it's only 15-ish meters per second, so a very easy burn. And there's the little lander in the distance, in fact. And there we are. So yeah, Bob, luckily, this was on a side where Bob could connect to the tracking station and then could therefore create maneuver nodes. That was one disadvantage of bringing Bob over Valentina, which was, like I said, was my original plan. But I just very misogynistic, and also I was just so used to bringing Bob on missions that that was a joke, by the way. I was just so used to bringing Bob on missions that it was just an automatic reflex to add him to the command module rather than Valentina. Oh, well, maybe Val can come along for the grand finale. Yeah, there's our docking. I've talked about docking a lot, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but we're doing the Lowne lazy method of docking that doesn't require monopropellant, because for the first time in this series, I didn't bring any. I've been bringing monopropellant with us before, as well as RCS thrusters, because I'm aiming for this series to be kind of more catered for beginners. But Eve ain't no beginner's destination, so hopefully you can do docking like this without too much issue. Select the docking port that you're going to be aiming for, and just keep both of them, so for both ships, and keep them both automatically pointing towards their respective targets, and docking should be an absolute breeze. We'll have to do a few more kind of retrograde burns relative to the targets to keep our heading on course, but I don't know, I feel like this is easy enough at this point. You guys don't need me to tell you this stuff. So one potential weight-saving thing we could have done was not bother with the docking port on the lander. That's what I often do for EVE missions. I just have the nose cone on the end of the lander. The reason I wanted a docking port was, A, we could transfer any remaining liquid fuel into the mothership, which admittedly is going to make effectively no difference in the grand scheme of things because there's so little fuel remaining. But the main reason, as I've mentioned a few times in this series at this point, I don't want any debris left in orbit, which means by having the means to attach this to our mothership, we can use the mothership to deorbit the lander and let it crash into the surface of EVE, keeping space free from debris. Obviously, make very careful sure that you transfer your Kerbal via an EVA so we can take all of the data from the now doomed lander can and transfer it into the mothership so that we actually get to keep the science that we worked so very hard to earn. And there it is there. Am I going to perform our retrograde burn or making sure that we deactivate that terrier, of course? Lovely shot of our Kerbals there. I did think about keeping this attached, I should say. That's the second time I've made that mistake. Keeping it attached, just for kind of realism purpose, gives a little bit more room in this ship for our Kerbals to move around. They could use that side tank there as a meditation room or something. I don't know what Kerbals do. But I just thought, we'll just deorbit it. I cannot be bothered. Now, it's a case of setting Kerbin as our target, making a nice big prograde burn. I need to slow myself down, really. I'm getting excited because we're nearly at the end of this video, even though there's still 10 minutes to go, I think. The reason why there's 10 minutes to go will become very obvious to you soon. We're making our maneuver node at EVE, and as you can see, we couldn't get a good Kerbin encounter because we're on too much of a tilt. So we're going to create a second maneuver node at our descending node and get our tilt correct, and then we can carry on modifying our EVE escape burn and we can get our Kerbin encounter. Bear in mind that once we delete that second maneuver node, it's going to disappear again, but we know now that once we do this burn, we can do a very simple burn in deep space and get our Kerbin encounter no problem. And we know it's not going to be a problem because we've got over 5,000 meters per second of delta V. This is really an episode of excess, an odyssey of overkill, because we've got way too many batteries. I don't know why I did that ring of batteries to this ship, honestly, because we've already got that massive one by the nuclear engine, and we've got RTGs and more batteries inside the actual service bay doors of the command pod itself. So we didn't really need those. We didn't need the big Commutitron dish, and we didn't need all the fuel for the initial Kerbin to EVE transfer stage either. But this is like an ideal first EVE mission, things like that. You don't want to be leaving up to chance. I wanted to make sure we had as much Delta V as we possibly could so that there was no chance of us running out of fuel. The only exception to that, of course, was the EVE Ascender itself. EVE Ascender are always very kind of tooth and nail. They're always going to be fairly close in terms of fuel. I didn't really want to make a lander that would have loads and loads of fuel left in EVE orbit because that's just a little bit overkill. And with a colossal, like a really, really big EVE lander, which will make it very difficult to fly from Kerbin to EVE and make it very difficult to land and make it very difficult to generally pilot. So that's why I went with that compromise. That's my summation of why this ship be designed this way. A good 40 minutes into this episode at this point. So we get to the aforementioned inclination change that we need to do, less than 300 meters per second, which we've got easily got the budget for. In fact, we've got enough budget to not even need to do any Kerbin aerobraking to capture back at our home world. But that gave me an idea, and that idea will become apparent to you when I finished this sentence in which I'm talking very slowly and in very stilted sentences. Here we go. Because I realised we've got enough fuel to do a Minmus landing. And why not, right? Why not go to Minmus? Because Bob had to be in contact with the Kerbal Space Center this whole time, he could get chatting with his friends there. And, his friends mentioned that they were running pretty low on mint ice cream on Kerbin. And Bob said, don't worry, guys. We've got enough fuel to get to Minmus on our way back to Kerbin. I'm sure Jebediah won't mind after his very traumatic experience on the surface of having to contend with the horrific atmosphere of EVE. I'm sure he'll be fine doing a quick detour to Minmus. I mean, look at him. Jebediah is what am I saying? Of course Jebediah is going to be happy. So we can zoom in down to Kerbin, perform our capture burn, but we don't need to do much deceleration after that because Minmus is very, very high above the surface of the planet. So, is there much to talk about here at this point? Probably not. We can just get ready to perform our Minmus encounter. Minmus, we got very lucky. I'm not going to lie, we got very, very lucky with the Minmus encounter. We can get one pretty much without having to do any adjustments whatsoever aside from an initial capture burn. I was about to say, you may not get this lucky, but I'm not intending this to be part of the tutorial at this point. This is just, if you want the tutorial part of this, it would just be continue decelerating until you end up in an atmospheric entry and decelerate and deploy your parachutes. Now we're in the I got bored and wanted to use our Delta V for something, so here we go. We're doing our Minmus encounter here and getting ready to perform our circularization burn, which is going to be fairly cheap. Less than 250 meters per second. And how much Delta V we still got over 2,000 meters per second left in this stage, so it's not even going to be close in terms of getting back to Kerbin after this. We've got so much extra fuel remaining. So yeah, normally I advocate aiming for like the big flat biomes of Minmus when you're doing a Minmus landing because they're far easier to land on, but I was like, no, I'm a pro, I don't need to worry about that. Then I remember that I'm not actually descending in a very lander-esque ship. It's going to be very, very imbalanced on the surface. I thought maybe we probably should actually land for somewhere that's flat, and then I spied that little area over there, so I decided to splurge some of our excessive Delta V in maneuvering ourselves towards this little flat area just here. The ice cream readings in this region were off the charts, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen. That's the real reason why we've come here. So we just boost down towards it and get ready to perform our surface landing. We've got to be touching down very, very, very slowly and with with no horizontal speed at all, because you may have noticed that we're very tall, very non-lander shaped. We don't want to be risking toppling over. But that is a very stable landing, if I do say so myself. Bob Kerman, jealous of Jebediah Kerman's adventure this week, because this is the first time where he's not been the Kerbal that goes down to the surface of a new planet or moon. He insisted on being the one that did this. So there he is. He's gathering his mint ice cream, turning back to have a good look at the ship, and of course planting our flag as well. How could you not do a landing in Kerbal Space Program without planting a flag? Bob returns to Minmus because, this was very nearly the last episode of the series. So I thought it'd be kind of nice to nearly end the series with what was nearly the very first flight we did. The very first mission of this series was a Minmus mission with Bob Kerman. Kind of fitting that the last mission would be a Minmus landing. But that didn't work out because this isn't actually the last mission, but whatever. The Minmus landing the first time wasn't the first landing we did. That was just landing on another place on Kerbin. So I guess, or what I'm trying to say is that I'm stalling time because I've got nothing else to talk about. I'm running out of steam, guys. Goodness, it's 42 minutes. How often have I made Kerbal videos that are longer than 40? I think this might be the longest Kerbal Space Program video I've done. I think the first junior tutorial I did was about 40 minutes long. I'm pretty sure I've probably done a MUN mission at somewhere that's of this length. And I think I did an SS2 tutorial that was about 40 minutes as well. But even so, this is pretty well. Pat yourself on the back, guys. We've all done well. And there's a little a little look at our very first landing site there. And well, there's Kerbin looming ahead in the distance. We can just do a quick deceleration burn to make sure that we actually enter the atmosphere. We've got a cheeky MUN assist, so I have to be careful that I overshot there. I have to be careful that our power is still visible. If we were to enter with a power that low, we would probably just explode on re-entry. Not because we'd run out of ablator, but because the kind of general heating effects that would hit the lander cam would be too much, especially because we're going down. The lander cam we have here has quite low heat tolerance compared to the Apollo-style command pod, so we still want to be careful. And obviously we don't want Jebediah and Bob to black out from G-forces, so I was happy with this. We're still going to be landing in the sea. I think we're not going to... Oh, I'm pretty sure we're going to land... Yeah, we're going to land in the sea. It's fine. There was loads of room. We can open up our command bay doors as well and deploy our parachutes. We didn't need 4 parachutes, but it looks nice and symmetrical, so we've got those. And again, I just got a bit paranoid. I decided to do a quick review of our data, make sure we hadn't forgotten anything. If we wanted to, we could have done some surface sampling and stuff at Minmus to get a bit of additional science, but we've already done Minmus science, and I've already said before that we're already doing 1 biome per planet or moon, so can't cheat some extra science from Bob landing on Minmus. So what we've got is what we've got. I'm pretty happy with it. And there is our splash down there. Finally, our Kerbals can breathe easy and soak in the sights. Literally soak in the sights. It's very wet, this area. The sea is rather wet. Yes, great insight. Thank you, Matt. Lovely little, beautiful cinematic shot of our Kerbals awaiting rescue. We can just skip ahead though to our science clock here. We've got 1,970 science, which is not that much considering we've been averaging about 4,000 science from atmospheric planet missions. But don't forget, we couldn't do any science from a space high above Eve or space low to close to Eve either, so we didn't get quite as much science as you normally would have got. So we couldn't actually finish unlocking the tech tree. Woe is me. We're 400 science points short. Big oof. So, guys, where are we going to send the final mission of this series? Do let me know. I will read the comments. I am actually away this weekend, but I will read the comments on Monday, and I will listen to your suggestions, and hopefully we'll have something special planned for the finale. As for right now on screen, there is a link to the full playlist on the left-hand side for the previous episodes. On the right was a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm. There's also links to my Patreon and to subscribe, and in the description you'll find links to my Instagram, merchandise, and Discord. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.